Good evening, night owls, and welcome to Whisper Crowley. Tonight, I will guide you into a world of darkness, hoping to help you relax and unwind. Perhaps some of you will even drift into a haunting yet soothing sleep. Before we begin, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. And now, we begin. This is a creepy story about a guy I used to know. We were friends for a few years, but not particularly close. I was at the university and saw him occasionally at parties. His name was Nick, and we always had a good time when he was around. I had the impression we were pretty good friends, but outside of these gatherings, we never really had contact. Back then, I lived with 3 friends in a house. We rented the entire house and split the rent equally among the 4 of us. Each person only paid $350, pretty cheap. That was in 2016, though, so it might sound like a better deal today than it really was. It was an older house in pretty bad condition. The floors were creaky and somehow always dirty even after cleaning. It was so bad that we wore shoes most of the time, even inside the house. But it wasn't far from campus, so it was perfect for us as students. One evening, I was at a bar with 2 of my roommates and another friend. We saw Nick there, and he pulled up a chair to our table. After a while, he said he needed accommodation. He was living alone in an apartment at the time, but could no longer afford it and had to move out. As we left the bar and walked home, I talked with my roommate Sean. He mentioned that we had an unused room in the house that could perhaps serve as a bedroom. Actually, it was more of a large storage room directly next to the living room, just big enough for a single bed to fit. Sean thought it was cool that Nick would move in with us, and I agreed. After some back and forth, we decided to offer him the room. He came over to see it. We had already emptied the room, and it seemed surprisingly large when there was no junk in it anymore. There was even light and an electrical outlet, but no window. When he saw it, he immediately said yes. He probably didn't have much choice anyway. At first, it seemed like a good decision. We all saved some money on rent, and another roommate made the atmosphere livelier. Nick was uncomplicated, and we all got along quite well. We watched movies together in the evenings and sometimes even cooked together. One thing I should mention about him, he was a smoker, and I don't mean cigarettes. We were college students back then, and smoking was pretty common. One of my other roommates was also quite enthusiastic about it, so it wasn't a big issue at first. But Nick smoked constantly. I really wondered where he got all the money for it, because with his consumption, it must have been expensive. A few weeks passed until something really happened. One afternoon, I came home from an early lecture. As I walked to the front door, I saw that the mail had arrived. Usually, it was just advertising, but sometimes there were also coupons I could use. I took the mail from the box and went into the living room. I sat down at the coffee table and spread out the letters. To my surprise, there was an envelope addressed to me from Capital One, the credit card company. At first, I thought it was just advertising to get me to apply. But when I opened it, there was a new credit card inside with my name on it. I immediately thought it was a mistake and called the company. After waiting forever on hold, I finally spoke to someone. They assured me that I had applied for the card myself, but I could cancel it if I wanted. I was still confused, but canceling seemed like the best option. As I hung up, I sat there for a while thinking about it. That was the moment when I began to suspect Nick. He lived in the house, had access to our things when we weren't there, including my documents. But accusing someone without evidence was just mean. I talked to one of my roommates, hoping there were other clues, but I was the only one who had received such a mysterious card. In the following days, things also began to disappear around the house. Sean said money was missing from his room. We all began to suspect Nick, maybe because we didn't quite trust him, and because all this happened shortly after he moved in. When Nick came home that evening, we confronted him directly in the living room. As soon as I accused him, he became angry and started yelling. I was sitting on the couch, and he came toward me, stood over me, and demanded several times that I stand up. But I knew it would lead to a fight if I did that, so I stayed seated. Nevertheless, he leaned down, grabbed my shirt, and tried to pull me up. He almost tore it off my body before one of the others pulled him back. Then he turned around and punched my roommate Andrew in the face. At that moment, we all intervened. We brought him to the ground and held him down for a while. Eventually, we let him go. He didn't become violent again after that, and we were able to get him out the door. I was afraid he would come back at night and trash the house, but he didn't come. Where he spent the night, I still don't know, but I was glad he was gone. However, he still had a key, so I was still nervous. We didn't see him for the next few days, neither at the university nor in the house. One night, it was probably around 3 a.m, I was lying awake and couldn't sleep. Suddenly, I heard the front door open. At that moment, I knew it was Nick. It couldn't have been anyone else. A little later, I heard footsteps on the stairs, and then my bedroom door was torn open. Nick came straight at me, grabbed me by the shoulder, and threw me to the floor. I was still conscious and screamed for help. Within seconds, 2 of my roommates stormed into the room, pulled him to the ground, and held him down. This time, I immediately called the police, something we should have done the first time. When the officers arrived, I also told them about the credit card incident. They themselves didn't handle such cases, but gave me the number for the Financial Crimes Department. Apparently, credit card fraud is a serious matter, and when I called there, they could actually prove it was Nick who had submitted the application. I don't know exactly how they found out, but they could trace it back. At least we now had proof that it was him. But that wasn't the end yet. We eventually had to clear out his room. When we did that, we found a small plastic box, transparent, bluish plastic. I opened it, and inside were several used syringes and other drug paraphernalia. He spent some time in jail, but when he got out, he stayed away from us. We never spoke to him again. At the end of the semester, he dropped out of college, and as far as I know, he moved away. The whole experience was a wake-up call for all of us about being more careful about who we let into our lives and our home. Looking back, there were warning signs we should have paid attention to. Nick's constant need for money, his erratic behavior, the way he seemed to know things about our schedules and routines that we hadn't told him. He had been watching us, learning our patterns, planning his moves. The credit card fraud was probably just the beginning. If we hadn't caught him when we did, who knows how far he would have gone. Identity theft, burglary, or worse, Nick was clearly capable of escalating his criminal behavior. The scariest part was realizing how vulnerable we had been. We had given a virtual stranger access to our home, our personal belongings, our sense of security. It took months before any of us felt truly safe in the house again. We changed all the locks, of course, but the psychological damage lasted much longer. Every unexpected noise, every shadow in the hallway, every time we came home to find something slightly out of place, it all brought back memories of Nick and what he had done. The university was surprisingly unhelpful when we reported the incident. They said since it happened off campus and Nick wasn't officially enrolled as a student anymore, it wasn't their jurisdiction. It was a frustrating reminder that we were on our own when it came to protecting ourselves. Sean ended up moving out at the end of the semester. He said he couldn't shake the feeling that Nick might come back, that he might be watching the house, waiting for another opportunity. I couldn't blame him. I had the same fears. The house felt different after that. What had once been our refuge, our party spot, our home away from home, now felt contaminated by Nick's presence. Even after we thoroughly cleaned his room and replaced the carpet, there was still something unsettling about the space. We learned later that Nick had a history of similar incidents at other places he had lived. The police told us he was a repeat offender, someone who specialized in gaining the trust of young people, and then exploiting that trust for financial gain. It made me angry to think about how many other people he had probably victimized, how many other students he had manipulated and stolen from. But it also made me grateful that we had discovered his scheme when we did, before he could do even more damage to our lives. I hope you enjoyed the first story. If you did, don't forget to leave a like. But if I didn't do my job well, feel free to give it a thumbs down. Either way, drop a comment and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, let's continue. I have a story from my time at university. This was in the mid-90s, and what happened didn't occur directly to me, but to my former roommate in the dorm. It's also the reason she moved to campus and switched to the dormitory in the first place. Of course, I won't mention the name of the university or my city. I'll just say we lived in the Southwest. I lived most of my college years on campus, but the university had arranged it so that you weren't required to live on campus at all. Many took advantage of this. They lived with family, with friends, and so on. My friend, later my roommate, and the person this story is about, was a small girl named Stacy. Stacy was one of those girls who never really got much taller than they were in middle school. She was very petite at the time, so she was often thought to be weak or mistaken for a teenager trying to pass as an adult. When I got to know Stacy better, I quickly realized she was a real bundle of energy. She had taken several self-defense courses and knew how to defend herself properly, if necessary. After a while of living with me in the dorm, she told me about her previous living situation and what had happened that made her move to campus. When she started her first semester, she didn't want to live on campus because of the additional costs. So she intensively scoured the classified ads. This was the mid-90s, 1996, if I remember correctly. So the internet wasn't an option yet. She said she met with several people in the weeks before the semester began and was slowly getting worried because none of the places she looked at seemed worth the money. At dinner, she complained about this to her mother, and her mother mentioned a coworker who had a son studying at the same university. She said he had his own apartment and that the coworker was financing the whole thing for him. She said she would talk to her to get more information about him. Maybe that would be an option. Stacy was pretty desperate, so she was willing to at least consider it, even though she had never met him before. She then met with the son, let's call him AJ, and he seemed like a pretty easygoing guy. He lived in a 2-bedroom apartment and was only using the second room to store his things. They agreed pretty quickly that she would take the free room as long as she furnished it herself. His parents would continue to pay the rent as long as she contributed to groceries. Basically, she had found a pretty good arrangement that initially seemed to work well too. She said that at first, everything was fine. AJ and she had hardly any contact with each other. She worked part-time and was a full-time student, so they rarely crossed paths. The first month went completely smoothly. AJ was friendly when they saw each other, but after about a month, he tried to talk to her more. It wasn't directly creepy, but he was very intent on getting to know her better, whether she had a boyfriend, what she was studying, what she wanted to achieve in life, and so on. Because she thought he just wanted to build a friendship, which wasn't bad in itself, but he kept asking and asking, and for her, it slowly felt intrusive. She tried to set clear boundaries. She told him that while she appreciated that he wanted to get to know her, she would prefer if he didn't interfere so much in her private life. If you know Stacy like I do, you know she can sometimes be quite direct. She says what she thinks, but in a factual and not impolite way. She said AJ seemed to understand what she meant and that the conversation was respectful. But after that, everything only got worse. For a few days, AJ was somewhat cold to her, but then he became like before again, including the personal questions. Stacy then began giving only brief or false answers because it was obvious he wouldn't stop. It was annoying, but according to her, not bad enough to end the living situation immediately. Until about a week later, on a day when Stacy was free, no work, no university, AJ wasn't home during the day, and she wanted to tidy up something in the apartment. She took his backpack to move it from the floor and put it in his room. When she opened the door and wanted to put the backpack on his bed, she noticed that a pair of underwear was lying on his nightstand. At first, she thought it might be from his girlfriend, but after a few moments, she realized it was a pair of her underwear. Of course, she was totally disgusted. It wasn't lying somewhere where you could accidentally confuse it with laundry. It was deliberately placed on his nightstand right next to the bed. From that point on, she'd had enough. His curiosity, his intrusive manner, and now this. That was the moment she decided to immediately look for new accommodation. But that wasn't the end yet. When AJ came home, Stacy confronted him directly about the underwear in his room, and the whole thing escalated completely. He said he had taken it because he needed to know what size she wore, and that he had even more of her clothes in his room for exactly this reason. He said he wanted to give the things back to her soon, but that he had a surprise for her and needed to know her sizes for that. Then he went back to his room and came back with something that looked like a wedding dress. Then he got down on his knees and asked Stacy if she would literally honor him by becoming the woman he would spend the rest of his life with. Of course, she said no, and she immediately began looking for a new home. She said she no longer felt safe around him, and for the few weeks she still lived there, she slept every night with a nightstand in front of the door, just in case. Apparently, AJ didn't speak a word to her after that, and was hardly ever home. She packed her things, registered with the university, and moved into the dorm, becoming my roommate. She was shocked by how obsessed he had been with her, so much so that he stole her clothes to learn her size and bought a wedding dress. Some might say it's not that bad, but I'm completely on Stacy's side. That was damn creepy. If he had simply been in love with her and taken it slow, that would have been one thing. Then he would have learned that Stacy wasn't heterosexual anyway. But the way he went about it was bizarre and obsessive, stealing her clothes to know her measurements, and then spending money on a wedding dress for someone he had only known for 2 months. Obviously not the best approach. Stacy moved out as quickly as possible and never spoke to him again. The whole experience left her pretty shaken up. She told me later that she had started questioning her ability to judge people's character. How had she missed the signs that AJ was becoming dangerously fixated on her? Looking back, she could identify the red flags, the excessive interest in her personal life, the way he seemed to study her movements around the apartment, the fact that he had somehow gotten into her laundry to steal her clothes. But at the time, she had explained away each incident as awkwardness or friendly interest. The wedding dress incident was particularly disturbing because it showed how far his fantasy had progressed. In his mind, they were already in a relationship heading toward marriage. He had constructed an entire narrative without her participation or consent. What scared Stacy most was wondering what would have happened if she had stayed longer. Would AJ have escalated further? Would he have become violent when she inevitably rejected his advances? The fact that he had been secretly collecting her belongings suggested he was capable of much more invasive behavior. The university's housing office was understanding when she explained the situation, and they expedited her move to the dorms. She learned to trust her instincts better after that experience. When something felt off, she didn't dismiss it anymore. Years later, she heard through mutual acquaintances that AJ had been involved in a similar situation with another female roommate. Apparently, it was a pattern of behavior for him. That knowledge was both validating and frightening because it confirmed her instincts had been right, and frightening because it meant he was still out there, still targeting vulnerable young women who just needed a place to live. I was 30 when I decided to look for a cheaper apartment. My old place had become too expensive, and I needed a quick solution. One day, I discovered an ad for a room in a 3-bedroom house. The rent was low, and the landlord, Mr. Thompson, asked hardly any questions. He didn't even do a background check. I found that strange, but I was in a hurry and couldn't afford to be picky. The house was old, with creaking floorboards and narrow hallways, but it felt adequately cozy for my needs. When I first toured the house, Mr. Thompson showed me the layout: 3 bedrooms, a small kitchen, a cozy living room, and a shared bathroom. He barely spoke about rules or expectations. I only knew I would have a roommate named Elizabeth. That same afternoon, I signed a simple lease and moved in. As I put my moving boxes in my new room, I felt a slight chill in the air. I told myself it was just the old house settling around me. Elizabeth worked nights and slept during the day. Because of her schedule, we barely encountered each other. In the first month, I didn't see her even once, not even briefly. Her door was always closed, and hardly a sound came from her room. Although she seemed very withdrawn, I sometimes had the feeling that someone else was in the house, as if someone was watching me from a hidden corner. At first, I thought I was just restless because I was living with a stranger I never saw. But shortly after I had settled in, strange things began to happen. I would put my keys on the kitchen counter, only to find them later on the dining table. My toothbrush, which I kept in a cup next to the sink, was sometimes damp even though I hadn't used it. I tried to find logical explanations. Maybe I was stressed and forgot where I put things, or maybe the old house caused small shifts through drafts. But the more time passed, the harder it became for me to ignore the growing unrest within me. One evening, I came back from work and noticed that the front door was slightly open. I was sure I had locked it in the morning. My heart began to beat faster. I carefully stepped inside and called out, "Hello, is anyone there?" The house was quiet, but the silence was tense. Nothing seemed to be stolen or moved, and yet I had the feeling that someone had just been there. That night, I checked all windows and doors 3 times, making sure every lock was secure. Still, I tensed at every creak of the house. Late at night, I began to hear soft sounds. Sometimes they sounded like light footsteps from the upper floor. Other times, I heard a gentle humming, almost like a lullaby. These sounds made me freeze in my bed. I told myself it was just an old house, but the unsettling feeling in my back wouldn't go away. Even when Elizabeth was home, why was she walking around when she should be working? And if she wasn't there, who was making these sounds? Then came a Friday night that changed everything. I wanted to relax in the living room with a late TV show. Half distracted, I sipped my tea when I suddenly felt like I was being watched. My skin prickled. I looked over my shoulder, but there was nothing there. To stay calm, I turned back to the TV. Without warning, the ceiling light flickered and went out. Only the faint light from the TV remained. My stomach cramped. I slowly turned around, and in the doorway stood a figure. It was Elizabeth. She stood in the shadowy hallway, her face hidden in the darkness. I couldn't clearly see her eyes, but I felt her staring at me. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then she turned around and disappeared silently down the hallway, leaving me trembling behind. "Elizabeth," I called with a shaking voice. No answer. Fear raced through my body, and I hastily turned the light back on. Everything felt surreal. I ran to my room and locked the door. My thoughts were racing. Who was she really, and why did her presence feel so disturbing? That night I could barely sleep. Every rustle in the hallway sent a shiver down my spine. The next morning, I was sure I had to get away. I packed a small bag and went to a nearby motel, looking for a sense of safety. There I called Mr. Thompson and told him about the eerie incidents, including Elizabeth standing silently in the dark. He seemed concerned, but not surprised. He asked if I was okay, but gave no real explanation. Something in his voice made me suspect he knew more than he was admitting. After a much-needed rest at the motel, I decided to return to the house the next day to get the rest of my things. When I entered, the house seemed different. It was quieter, but the silence was heavy. I hurried to my room to pack clothes and personal items. On my way out, I noticed that Elizabeth's door was slightly open. My curiosity overwhelmed me, and I pushed it further open. The room was dimly lit, covered in dust, as if no one had lived there for a long time. A small bed stood against the wall, and old photographs hung on the wall. When I stepped closer, I saw that the photos showed a young woman who looked exactly like Elizabeth. In one of the pictures, Mr. Thompson stood next to her, clearly younger than today. Curious, I turned the photo over and saw a date, 20 years ago. My heart began to race. If these photos were so old, how could Elizabeth still look exactly the same today? Suddenly, I heard a soft creaking behind me and turned around in shock, but no one was there. Gripped by fear, I grabbed one of the photos and ran out of the house, determined to confront Mr. Thompson. I went directly to his office and showed him the picture. He turned pale and finally confessed that Elizabeth was his sister who had disappeared 20 years ago. He admitted that he had left her room untouched, hoping she would return one day. He couldn't explain how a person who looked like her had appeared in the house, or why she looked unchanged after all these years. Frightened and confused, I took my things and left the house with the firm resolve never to return. The experience left me questioning everything I thought I knew about reality. Was the woman I had been living with really Elizabeth, somehow returned after 20 years unchanged? Was it someone else who bore an uncanny resemblance to her? Or was there something even more impossible at work? I tried to research the house's history, looking for any records of unusual incidents or previous tenants who had reported strange experiences. What I found was disturbing. Over the past 2 decades, several tenants had reported similar encounters, with a mysterious woman matching Elizabeth's description. Some had stayed only days before fleeing. Others had tried to convince themselves it was their imagination until something undeniably supernatural occurred. One former tenant I managed to contact told me about finding wet footprints leading from the bathroom to Elizabeth's room, even though the room had been empty for years. Mr. Thompson eventually contacted me to say he was taking the house off the rental market. He said he needed time to resolve some family matters. I never found out what that meant, and I never heard from him again. Sometimes late at night, I still think about that house and the woman who may or may not have been Elizabeth. I wonder if she's still there, still walking those creaking floors, still waiting for something or someone. Part of me hopes she found peace. Another part of me is grateful I'll never have to find out. I'm a 27-year-old man. I graduated from college a few years ago, but what I'm reporting here happened in my first year of study when I lived on campus. For those who don't know how this works, you apply for a place in the dormitory and automatically get assigned a roommate. You fill out a small form so they can try to find someone who fits you, but I suspect the whole thing runs rather randomly. I was a so-called late student because I had worked for a few years to save money, so I was 21 in my first year. Maybe that was the only point they really considered when assigning me. My roommate was named Danny, and he was one of those typical punk rockers with gelled-up hair and always wearing some band t-shirts. He was also a bit older. I think he was 22. He had moved in before me, so he had taken the bed that was farther from the door. When I came in, he stood up, we shook hands, and he seemed nice. But after a while of conversation, it became clear that we didn't have much in common. I was more the type who liked to read and play video games, while Danny was into loud music and parties. What particularly bothered me was that he smoked cigarettes. The smell constantly hung in our room. The dorm had a smoking ban, of course, but the stench definitely came in through his clothes. It wasn't something we fought about, but it created tension. We rarely did anything together. I had found some friends on our floor, but Danny kept more to himself. After about a month, he was going out most weekends, probably to punk concerts or parties off campus. All I knew was that he left early and came back late or sometimes not at all. If I had to guess, he probably slept in our room maybe half the nights, which didn't bother me because, that way, I had more space. He had no friends in the dorm, but started hanging out with some guys who weren't students at our university. They also looked like punk rockers. He probably met them at a concert. They sometimes came over but never stayed particularly long. One evening, however, I came to our room and saw 4 or 5 of these older guys hanging around there. They were drinking beer, and one was even smoking, though he was blowing the smoke out the window. They were probably in their 30s or even older. I politely said hello and tried not to let anything show. But after less than 5 minutes, I went to a friend down the hall and stayed there until it got late. When I returned to my room around 1 in the morning, they were gone, and Danny didn't come back that day either. The next evening, however, he came back around 10 p.m. We didn't talk much because I was sitting at my computer studying, but I glanced at him, and he looked like he hadn't slept at all. If I had to guess, I'd say he was drinking heavily and doing drugs. Honestly, that was obvious. Over time, Danny's new friends came over more and more frequently. I didn't understand why he was hanging out with these older guys and tried to avoid them as much as possible. I spent more time in the library or with my friends down the hall. Once Danny got a warning for bringing these people into the dorm. He had also been warned for smoking in the building. It seemed more and more like he would be kicked out soon. As harsh as it sounds, I was somehow hoping for that. Not because I hated him, but he was simply annoying as a roommate. Then there was another evening when Danny was partying with his friends in our room. I went in briefly, stayed a bit, but quickly realized this wasn't my world. There were no visible drugs involved, but I got a really bad feeling about one of his friends. I can't remember his name anymore, but the guy must have been about 35 years old, over 300 pounds, bald with a jean vest and torn jeans. Around 10 p.m., I retreated as usual to my friend in the next room. I could hear everything through the wall. After midnight, I heard the dorm supervisor, arguing with them about the noise. It was a weeknight, after all. They argued for a while, but eventually I heard them leave. I went back to my room after that, aired it out because of the cigarette smoke, and went to sleep. I didn't see Danny the next day, nor the day after that. That wasn't unusual for him. Sometimes he disappeared for a few days. But after about a week, I started to worry. The exams for the first semester were approaching, so we had already been roommates for a few months. I asked around the dorm, but no one had seen him. I tried calling him, but his phone went straight to voicemail. I sent him several messages, but got no response. Eventually, I decided to report him missing. I went to campus security and reported Danny. After that, I felt a little guilty that I hadn't said something earlier, but I was just hoping he would show up soon with a plausible explanation. After I reported him, I was questioned a few times by campus security about his friends and the guys he hung out with. I told them everything I knew, which unfortunately wasn't much. He had hardly any contacts on campus, and these older men were complete strangers to me. I didn't know a single name and had no way to contact them. One evening, I was sitting with some friends in the common room when we saw a police car pull up in front of the dorm through the window. 2 officers went directly to the room. I immediately had the feeling it was about Danny. Later, the Raw came to my room with the two police officers. They asked me the same questions as campus security. It was just about when I had last seen Danny and who he was hanging out with. I repeated my answers, but the police officers behaved more like they were interrogating me, as if they didn't believe me or thought I was hiding something. Maybe they found it strange that I knew so little about my roommate's friends. After a while, the officers left again, and we talked about it in the dorm for a long time. Some thought he had simply run away. Others suspected that something bad had happened to him. But no one knew anything specific. A few weeks passed without any word from Danny. The police came back a few more times, but didn't talk to me anymore. Apparently, they had ruled me out. They believed Danny was involved in something with these older men. They did find these guys later, but in my opinion, they weren't helpful. One or more of them must have had something to do with his disappearance. Whether it was an accident or not, I don't know, but they surely know something. We never got an answer. The year passed, and my roommate never came back. Danny had simply vanished without a trace. The police investigation went cold after a few months. His parents came to campus once to collect his belongings. That was one of the most heartbreaking things I witnessed during my college years. They were clearly devastated, still holding on to hope that their son would come home. His mother asked me about his state of mind, whether he had seemed depressed or mentioned wanting to disappear. I told her honestly that he had seemed fine, just involved with the wrong crowd. The university assigned me a new roommate for the spring semester, but the room never felt the same. Danny's bed, his desk, the corner where he used to pile his band t-shirts, everything held memories of someone who had simply vanished from existence. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I had been a better roommate, if I had tried harder to connect with him, or warned him about the dangerous path he seemed to be on. Maybe if he had felt less isolated in the dorm, he wouldn't have been so drawn to those older men who clearly had their own agenda. The case remained officially open for years, but I never heard of any new developments. Danny became one of those missing person cases that fade from memory, another face on a poster that eventually gets taken down and forgotten. But I never forgot him. Even now, years later, I sometimes think I see him in a crowd or catch a glimpse of someone with his distinctive walk. It's always someone else, of course, but that moment of recognition reminds me that somewhere out there, Danny's story had an ending that none of us will ever know. When I was about 18 years old, I made some bad decisions and constantly argued with my mother. I decided to move out of her house and moved in with a guy I was dating at the time. He was somewhat shady and had shady friends too. But I was at an age where I thought I knew everything better and didn't listen to anyone. We had to move out of the apartment we were living in at the time. A guy my boyfriend had once worked with offered to let us stay with him, so we moved in with him. At the time, we didn't have a car and I didn't have a job. My boyfriend was looking for work. Since the guy we were staying with worked night shifts, he was always home during the day. That meant I was alone with him all the time while my boyfriend was out looking for work. So it was just me and this guy. He was a drinker, but not an aggressive drinker. One of those who constantly sits around drinking beer and doesn't really do anything. So initially, it wasn't a big deal. He was somewhat creepy and often stared at me, but I was young and stupid and didn't think much of it. The place we lived was a trailer with 2 bedrooms, but the kind that doesn't have real doors. Instead, there were only plastic curtain doors that didn't close properly. Only the guy's bedroom had a real door. All the other rooms had these weird curtains. This becomes important later. In the first few days, everything was fine. The guy shared his beer with us and mostly left us alone. On the first day my boyfriend went job hunting, I was alone with this guy. I was sitting in the living room playing solitaire with a deck of cards and listening to the radio. The guy came out of his room and started staring at me again. I found it somewhat creepy, but thought, well, he seems harmless, so I ignored him. He sat there for about an hour, drinking beer and staring at me. Then he said he wanted to take a nap. Shortly after, I heard strange sounds from the back room, uncomfortable sounds that I'd rather not describe in detail. Grunting and groaning, all kinds of things. It was weird, but since he was letting us live there rent-free, I thought, whatever. Eventually, my boyfriend came back. The guy came out again and acted like everything was completely normal. I found it strange, but when I went for a walk with my boyfriend and told him about it, he didn't seem particularly concerned. The next day, the same thing. My boyfriend went job hunting again, and I was alone with this creepy roommate. I sat in the living room again, playing cards and listening to the radio. Just like the day before, he came out, drank something, and stared at me. Then he said he was going to take a nap. This time, I heard the same sounds again, and then he started calling my name loudly. That really made me feel queasy, but like before, my boyfriend came back right on time, and the guy became quiet again. We went for a walk, I told him again, and this time he said that while it was strange, the guy was probably harmless. The next day, same routine. My boyfriend left to help with job searching. I sat in the living room on the couch playing cards. The guy came out, drank again, and this time he started talking to me. It was a really uncomfortable conversation about what had happened in the last few days. I felt extremely uncomfortable and went outside to wait for my boyfriend. When he came back, I told him again. This time, he suggested we get my dog from my mother. The dog I had at the time was a small Pomeranian, but very aggressive, at least something. So we went to my mother that same evening and picked up the dog. The next day, my boyfriend spent the night at his buddy's place to help with moving and left me alone. Really bad decision. Since I knew he wouldn't be there that night, I decided to retreat to the bedroom with the dog instead of staying in the living room. I locked my dog in his crate and lay down on the bed with a blanket because the curtain doors couldn't be closed properly. I lay down to sleep early in the day while the guy was at work because I was sure I wouldn't be able to sleep at night. Next thing I knew, I woke up because my dog was completely freaking out. He was barking, growling, and baring his teeth in his crate. I turned just slightly, just enough to look at the door without making it obvious that I was awake. And there, he was standing in the doorway. I was completely panicked because there was no real escape route from the room if he had wanted to come in and do whatever he wanted. I had nothing to defend myself with except a 4-pound dog. I pretended I was still sleeping and rolled to the side so he couldn't see me, but I could see him. He opened the door wider to get a better view of me. I was completely freaking out. I sat up and slid into the corner of the room where he would have had to really come in to see me. I asked, "Can I help you with something?" He made a strange sound and staggered down the hallway. I stood up, took my dog's leash, and decided to leave this house immediately. When I came into the living room to leave, he was sitting on the couch staring at me again. Then he started talking again. "So I think this isn't working out here. You and your boyfriend should probably look for another place." Yeah, that's probably a good idea," I said. "I'll tell him when he gets back. I think we'll figure something out. I'm going for a walk with the dog now." I decided to walk several miles to my boyfriend's buddy's house because I absolutely didn't want to be alone with this creeper in the house again. I started walking, and the guy just stared after me. But I knew that wasn't the end yet. About half a mile away, I suddenly heard his moped behind me. I thought he was just going out to buy beer or something, so I stepped aside. But he drove up next to me and started yelling at me. He was screaming that I had seduced him, and then he said we had until the end of the night to get out of his house. I honestly thought he was going to attack me or something, but after about 10 minutes of yelling, he just got back on his moped and drove away. I walked as fast as I could. By now, it was pretty late, about midnight, and pitch dark because it was a rural area without street lighting. The entire route to my boyfriend's friend's house was dark. I didn't even think about taking my things. I went straight there. It was certainly 10 to 13 miles. A few days later, we got a ride back to the guy's house to get our stuff while he was at work. He had said he had left everything on the porch. When we got there, all my underwear was missing and some of my other clothes were cut up. It was the creepiest thing I had ever seen. We just threw most of it away. Later, we found out that the guy was known in the area as Uncle Pervert because he had gotten into trouble a few years earlier for exactly the same thing with someone else. The whole experience taught me to trust my instincts and never ignore red flags, no matter how desperate my living situation might be. Looking back, I realize how lucky I was that nothing worse happened. The guy was clearly unstable and had been escalating his behavior over the few days we lived there. The fact that he had been walking around the trailer at night while we slept was terrifying enough. But what really haunts me is the thought of what he had planned for that night when my boyfriend was away. The way he stood in my doorway, watching me sleep, the aggressive way he confronted me when I caught him. It all pointed to someone who was building up to something much worse. The stolen underwear was particularly disturbing because it suggested he had been planning this for a while. He had been collecting trophies, fantasizing about me, working himself up to act on his urges. If I hadn't had the dog with me, if I hadn't woken up when I did, the outcome could have been very different. My boyfriend and I broke up not long after that incident. The stress of the situation, combined with his failure to take my concerns seriously until it was almost too late, damaged our relationship beyond repair. I moved back in with my mother and spent months in therapy trying to process what had happened. The therapist helped me understand that what I had experienced was a form of sexual harassment and stalking. She explained that predators like Uncle Pervert often target young, vulnerable people who are in desperate situations and have limited options for escape. I learned that my initial instincts about the guy had been correct, and I should have trusted them from the beginning. The way he stared at me, the inappropriate sounds from his room, the invasion of my personal space. These were all warning signs that I had dismissed because I felt I had no choice. The experience changed how I approached living situations forever. I never again moved in with someone I didn't know well, and I always made sure I had a backup plan and my own transportation. Most importantly, I learned that no housing situation is worth compromising my safety and well-being. Years later, I heard through the grapevine that Uncle Pervert had been arrested for assault. I wasn't surprised, but I was grateful that someone else had been brave enough to press charges. I only wished I had been strong enough to do the same at the time. It all started on a Thursday evening in late October. I remember the exact day because Maya and I had just finished rearranging our living room, and we were both exhausted and starving. So we decided to order Chinese takeout instead of cooking. The sun was already setting, and the leaves outside our apartment in Portland, Oregon, had taken on that deep amber color that signals the real beginning of autumn. My name is Alina. I'm 26 years old, and I live with my best friend Maya in a modest 2-bedroom apartment on the second floor of a quiet 4-story building. Most of the residents kept to themselves, which was exactly how we liked it. Life here had always been peaceful, predictable, maybe even a little boring. That's probably why the change on the floor above us hit us harder than it should have. We didn't even notice someone had moved in until we heard the sound. It was around 11:45 at night, and I had just gotten out of the shower. The sound was unmistakable, something heavy being dragged across the hardwood floor directly above us. Slow, deliberate, then a loud thud. Silence. Then the dragging again, followed by another dull impact. I went to Maya's room. She was sketching something, wearing headphones. "Do you hear that?" I asked. She pulled one earbud out. "What that sound? Like someone moving furniture right above us." She paused and listened. The dragging sound came again, followed by that heavy thump. "Oh yeah, I think someone moved in today. I saw some moving boxes by the entrance earlier." "Who moves furniture at midnight?" I muttered. She shrugged. "Weird people. Welcome to apartment living." We both tried to laugh it off, but the sound didn't stop. We went to bed while the dragging was still faintly audible overhead. The next morning, I saw him. I was standing outside the building, lighting a cigarette before heading to work. He came down the stairs behind me, not hurried, but calm and controlled. He was tall, maybe 6'3", with broad shoulders, perfect posture, and movements that were precise and silent. He wore a dark jacket, black boots, and had an expressionless face. His features were sharp, strong jaw, symmetrical lines, short black hair. He looked like he'd stepped out of a fashion magazine. I smiled politely. "Good morning." He didn't acknowledge me, just walked past as if I were invisible. I watched him go. Something about the way he moved, too smooth, too quiet, made my stomach clench, though I had no concrete reason for the feeling. That night the dragging returned, this time louder, longer, and then the footsteps began. Heavy, slow pacing for almost an hour. We both sat awake in the living room. "Is he walking in circles?" Maya asked. "Sounds like it." Then came another loud bang. Not a drop, not a thump, something heavy being set down deliberately. We waited for silence. It never came. For the following nights it continued. The dragging, the footsteps, the heavy thuds, always late at night, always when the building was completely quiet. Maya stopped joking about it. "Should we complain?" she asked one evening. "If it doesn't stop by the weekend, yes," I said, but it didn't stop. It got stranger. By Saturday, I'd had enough. I hadn't slept more than 3 or 4 hours any night that week, and Maya looked just as exhausted. We knocked on his door one late afternoon when it was quiet in the building, but no one answered. No sound, no TV, no footsteps, as if the apartment were empty. But we knew better. "He's probably standing right behind the door," Maya whispered as we walked back down the stairs. "Don't say that." It was the kind of comment that sticks with you, not because it's far-fetched, but because it's possible. From then on, I felt watched every time we passed his door, as if someone were staring through the peephole. Then came the night of the smile. It was around 10 in the evening. I was taking the trash out alone. Maya was in the shower, and I just wanted some fresh air and a moment of quiet away from the tense atmosphere in our apartment. I went down the side stairs to the dumpsters behind the building. The street was nearly empty. A few cars under flickering streetlights, the air cold and dry. As I approached the entrance again, I saw him. He was standing directly in front of the main door, one hand in his coat pocket, the other holding what looked like a cigarette, though there was no smoke visible. He wasn't smoking it, just holding it. Slowly, he turned his head in my direction. "Good evening," I said automatically. He didn't respond. His eyes remained fixed on me, unmoving. Then, after a long pause, he smiled. But it wasn't a smile you'd return. It was thin and tight, without any warmth, just a strange, slight upturn of the corners of his mouth. A gesture that seemed more like an attempt at mimicking human expression than genuine emotion. I froze halfway between the dumpsters and the entrance, suddenly uncertain whether to walk past him or wait until he went inside. But he didn't move, just kept staring at me. Finally, I walked quickly around him. When I reached the stairwell door, I turned back once. He was still standing there, still staring at me. That night the dragging started earlier, around 9 in the evening, and didn't stop for almost 4 hours. Maya and I sat silently in the living room. We both pretended to watch a movie on her laptop. The sound was on, but neither of us was paying attention. The footsteps above us were louder than usual, like heavy boots on wood. Then, for the first time, we heard something else. A soft tapping, not at our door, from above. Tap, pause, tap, tap, longer pause, tap. No recognizable pattern. It wasn't furniture moving, wasn't tools. It sounded like knuckles on wood, deliberate, controlled. "What the hell is he doing up there?" Maya whispered. "I don't know," I answered, barely audible. We barely slept that night. The next day, we noticed something strange. I was sorting our mail in the building's entrance area when I noticed that the mailbox above our apartment had no name on it. Every other one had a printed name, tenant, or landlord. Only that one was blank, just an empty slot. I showed Maya later. "Maybe he's subletting," she said. "There should still be a name there." The more closely we looked, the stranger everything became. He never got packages, never ordered food, no TV sounds were audible, no lights in his windows even late at night when he was walking around. And most disturbing, we never saw him leave the building in the morning, only in the middle of the night, between 1 and 3 a.m. And he returned just before sunrise. One night our curiosity won. We stayed awake, sitting with the lights off by the window, watching the building entrance. Around 2:15, he left the building. He carried a long black duffel bag, the kind used for equipment or something else. He walked down the street without looking around. No glance left or right, no looking at cars or people. Maya leaned over and whispered, "He never looks. It's like he already knows no one's there." That hit me harder than anything before, and yet the dragging continued every night. The same sounds, the same stomping, but then something changed. Toward the end of the second week, I was alone at home. Maya had gone to her sister's overnight, and I didn't mind. I was lying in bed reading when I heard a new sound, scratching. This time it wasn't coming from above. It was coming from the wall next to my bed, the wall that separated my room from the stairwell. It was quiet, barely perceptible, but steady. Scratch. Pause. Scratch, scratch. I got up and pressed my ear to the wall. It stopped. I waited a full minute, heart pounding, but nothing happened. Then I slowly pulled back and sat on the edge of the bed, trying to shake off the unease. Maybe rats, old building, old pipes, tired mind. But when I turned off the light and lay back down, I heard it again. Only this time it wasn't scratching. It was breathing, heavy, right against the wall. I didn't sleep a single moment that night. I lay motionless in bed, eyes wide open, heart hammering in my ears. The breathing sound didn't stop. It was quiet but steady, directly on the other side of the wall. I kept telling myself it couldn't be real, that it was wind in the stairwell, maybe an echo, some trick of the old pipes. But deep down, I knew exactly what it was. Someone was standing directly outside my bedroom wall, breathing. When morning came, I felt like I'd aged 10 years overnight. Maya returned that afternoon, and as soon as she entered the apartment, she could tell something was wrong. "You look pale," she said. "Did something happen?" I told her everything. The scratching, the breathing, the eerie silence afterward. She didn't try to joke it off this time. She just sat there, holding her coffee mug with both hands, gripping it, as if clinging to the warmth to keep from losing her footing. "We need to talk to someone," she said. "Who? The police?" "No, the landlord." We called him that evening. An older man, polite but distant, as if he didn't want to get involved. "The man in 3B, he repeated when we asked who had moved in above us. "Yes, exactly," Maya said. "Do you know anything about him?" The landlord hesitated. "Short-term rental, paid cash. Foreign passport, Russian maybe, or Serbian. Quiet type, no complaints." "Did he give a name?" Another pause. "He did, I'd have to look it up." "He never did." That night something changed. The sounds stopped completely. No dragging, no footsteps, no pacing. It was the first quiet night in weeks. At first we were relieved, thinking he might have finally moved out. But by the third night without sounds, that relief transformed into something cold. The silence felt unnatural, like the calm before a storm. On the fourth night we smelled it. It started in the hallway, right outside our apartment door, a faint, sickly sweet, rotten smell. At first just a hint, like overripe fruit or spoiled meat left too long in the heat. I thought maybe an animal had died in the walls. Old buildings sometimes have problems with rodents. But when Maya opened the door and stepped into the hallway, she immediately recoiled. "God, what is that?" she said, covering her nose. Outside it was worse. Not exactly rotting, but sharp. Like ammonia and rust, like something that didn't belong in a residential building. We climbed the stairs step by step, holding our breath. The smell got more intense with each step. When we reached the landing in front of 3B, it was almost unbearable. Maya turned to me. "We need to call someone." "I'll do it," I said immediately. We went back to our apartment, and I called the property management office. They promised to send someone the next morning. Maybe a plumbing problem, maybe a dead animal. I didn't mention the man upstairs. I didn't know how to say it. Our neighbor is possibly hiding something that smells like death. Just didn't sound credible. That night I locked every door, every window. I barely moved from the couch. Maya stayed in the living room with me. We left the lights on. No one slept. At 3 in the morning, there was knocking at the front door, not at the building entrance, at our apartment door. It was soft, 3 short raps. Maya looked at me with wide eyes. We sat still, didn't move, didn't breathe. Another knock, slightly louder. I crept to the door and looked through the peephole. The hallway was empty. I waited a full minute before stepping back. My hands were shaking. "Alina," Maya whispered. "What if he—" We froze. The smell, it was coming through the cracks under the door, filling the apartment in seconds. My eyes watered. I pressed my sleeve over my mouth. It was the same sharp, metallic stench, only stronger, fresher. I opened the window and we sat next to it until sunrise, trying to breathe, trying not to lose our minds. In the morning, the smell was completely gone, as if nothing had happened. And the following night, the sounds returned. Not the dragging this time, something worse. Crying. At first it was barely audible, muffled, but it was there, coming from above. A deep, wrenching sobbing. Male, not panicked, not loud, just steady, painful, slow. Maya covered her ears. "Please tell me that's not real," she whispered. I couldn't answer. We sat there, listening to that terrible sound until it stopped hours later, and when it finally stopped, we realized something else had taken its place. Silence. And the smell again, drifting through the air vents in the ceiling. The next morning, our decision was made. We couldn't stay in this apartment any longer. I had already packed half my things before breakfast, and Maya had written to her cousin asking if we could stay with her for a few days. We just had to get out, breathe fresh air, get at least one night's sleep without footsteps, without knocking, without sobbing from above. But it never came to that. Around noon, there was knocking at the door, loud, firm, official. A police officer stood before us, tall, in uniform, face impassive. "There's been a complaint from the building," she said. "Several residents reported a strong smell on the 3rd floor." Maya and I looked at each other. "We smelled it too," I said immediately. "It was coming from 3B, the officer nodded, pulled out a small notebook, and began writing. "Do you know the resident?" "No," I said. "He moved in a few weeks ago. We don't even know his name. He's strange," Maya added. "He walks around at night. There are sounds, dragging, heavy thuds, footsteps, and the crying. We heard everything." The officer blinked, crying. "Last night, around 2 in the morning, it was a man's voice." She noted it and thanked us. They would knock, and if no one answered, the landlord had given permission to enter. We watched through the window as she went upstairs with another officer. 10 minutes passed, then 20, then we heard the door to 3B being broken down. And then nothing. No shouting, no voices, just silence. A few minutes later, the officers came back down. One looked pale, visibly shaken. The officer who had spoken with us said nothing. They left without knocking again. We didn't sleep a wink that night. The next day, a cleaning crew appeared. They wore masks, hauled large plastic containers and industrial-sized garbage bags. I watched them go up and down the stairs repeatedly, each time a little faster. One dropped a bag. It tore open. A sharp stench filled the stairwell, even stronger than before. Something slipped out, a large, blood-stained piece of fabric, thick like canvas. It looked like it had been used to wrap something heavy. They quickly stuffed it back in the bag, sealed it up, said nothing. In that moment, we knew we had been living beneath something horrible. Maya and I packed our things that same afternoon. We didn't even wait for evening. Her cousin let us stay in Salem. We didn't tell her the whole truth. We didn't know how to tell such a story without losing our minds. A week later, I called the landlord. I had to know. "What happened in 3B?" I asked. There was long silence on the other end. Then he said, "He should never have been there." "What do you mean?" "I never rented that apartment. It's been empty since June, being renovated. No working heat, no electricity, no running water. The floor is unsafe. The man you saw, whoever he was not a tenant." My blood ran cold, my mouth was dry. "But we saw him. We heard him. He had furniture. He was moving things. He smiled at me." Silence. "They found things in the walls," the landlord finally said. "Things I wasn't informed about. The police won't give details. They say it's part of an ongoing investigation. But one thing they told me, whoever lived there had done it before, in another place." Then he hung up. "I've tried to forget it, but I can't. Sometimes I hear that dragging again, late at night when the wind rattles the windows. Sometimes I wake up convinced someone is pacing back and forth above my bed. Maya doesn't talk about it anymore. She sleeps with music in her ears, every night to block everything out. And I still wonder, if he was never a tenant, who were we watching for 2 weeks? And more importantly, how long had he been watching us?" This happened a few years ago, just before the school year ended, on the last day of 8th grade. It was exactly what you'd expect on such a day: excitement, anticipation, and bittersweet goodbyes. Everyone was running around, having each other sign yearbooks, signatures, and cheesy messages everywhere. My middle school in Phoenix was huge, with over 1,200 students. To keep the chaos under control, the teachers collected our yearbooks and passed them around in different classrooms so anyone who wanted to could sign them. You can easily imagine how this could lead to problems. Anyone could write in anyone's yearbook, whatever they wanted. The teachers did their best to prevent incidents, but I knew a few students who left nasty comments for those they didn't like. At the end of the day, when I got my yearbook back, I flipped through the pages curiously, reading the silly messages from my friends. Then I noticed something. Under the photo of a boy I'd never seen before was a signature. His name, Samuel Robinson III. A name I'll never forget for the rest of my life. The message he had left was short, simple, and honestly quite disturbing. "Max, I'll see you again." I stared at the page, completely confused. I had never exchanged a single word with this Samuel, but what could I have done? The school year was over. Even if I had wanted to talk to him, it was too late. I just figured he was some weird kid who had done something weird. Maybe a mistake. Either way, I didn't think much more about it. A few hours passed, and before I knew it, I was at home in my basement having a sleepover with my best friends, Kevin, David, and Kieran. We were eating Doritos and playing Call of Duty all night. My parents' bedroom was 3 floors above us, so we didn't have to worry much about being quiet. Sometime shortly before 2 in the morning, we were fooling around on my dad's rowing machine, when suddenly there was a sharp knocking at the basement door. The sound made us instantly silent. Who the hell knocks on a basement door? It had to be someone who either didn't want to wake my parents or knew we were down there, or both. It made no sense. The person kept knocking in the same rhythmic pattern. I saw that Kieran wanted to say something, but I couldn't stop him in time. In a firm voice, he called out loudly, "Who's there?" I could have knocked him unconscious. He had practically told whoever was outside that we were down there. My basement has no outside windows, so it was unlikely that whoever it was knew we were there. But now they did. After a long pause and no more knocking, a muffled voice sounded. It said, "Come to the back door," in a high, almost cheerful tone, as if he were a friend who just wanted to join in the sleepover. It was definitely a teenager's voice, and it didn't sound like someone was intentionally disguising their voice either. I was pretty scared, I can't deny that. My friends, on the other hand, seemed completely unfazed, almost as if they found it exciting that some strange boy was standing outside my house. They pressured me to at least go look, and although I didn't want to, they put me under pressure. We crept quietly up the stairs, careful not to make noise. I slowly approached the back door while my heart beat wildly. Through the narrow glass window beside it, I could make out a dark figure standing under the dim outdoor light. I stepped closer, and when his face came into the light, my breath caught. It was him, Samuel Robinson III, the boy who had signed my yearbook. My friends wanted to open the door for whatever reason, but I held them back and said I knew who it was. I told them what had happened, and immediately their mood changed. While we were talking, Sam was still standing outside, and he could clearly see us. He must have noticed how scared I was because he began pointing with his hand to the side of the house, as if he wanted me to come to the window. You might wonder why we didn't take the situation more seriously, but I think it was because it wasn't some strange adult stranger, but a boy from our school. Still, I didn't open the door for him. Instead, I went to the kitchen window and opened it just a tiny crack. My friends followed me and stood somewhat apart. Sam came to the window. I asked him what he wanted and said I had recognized him from the yearbook. He smiled and said, "Ah, so you got my message," and introduced himself as Sam. Then he said he had been watching me from afar for a long time and that we could have been good friends. I just agreed with him to avoid making him angry, but in truth, no way. There was no conceivable moment when I would have been friends with this boy. I didn't want to confront him immediately, but I had to know. So I asked him how he knew where I lived. He didn't answer, and I didn't know what to say. Before I could calm the situation, David called him a creepy stalker and told him to get lost. Sam's smile disappeared. He tilted his head as if he didn't understand what David had just said. And then, quite suddenly, his face contorted into something I can only describe as pure hatred. He had just been calm, almost friendly. Now he was aggressive and full of rage. He began screaming, yelling at me that he hated my friends and that we should all die, that my ex-girlfriend had hated me, and all sorts of things he should never have known. He reached for the window and tried to push it open. I slammed it shut and locked it immediately. He snarled and pounded against the glass like a wild animal. He was only seconds away from breaking it, and I swear we must have made such a noise that my parents came storming down the stairs wanting to know why we had woken them. At that moment, Sam ran away. I told my parents as quickly as possible what had happened. My father ran outside in just his underwear, but came back a few minutes later without knowing where the boy had gone. Why they didn't call the police, I still don't know to this day. They just said we should go to sleep, and they would contact the school the next morning. Maybe to still give the boy the benefit of the doubt. The next morning, they actually contacted the school, and that's exactly when we learned the disturbing truth. Sam had already been expelled from school several weeks before the end of the school year. He shouldn't have been there on that last day at all. Apparently, the yearbooks had been printed before his expulsion, which explained why his photo was still included. That meant he had somehow gained access to the school just to leave me that message. The thought alone sent a chill through me that lingers to this day. Despite intensive cooperation with the school to find out more about him, no one could locate Sam. It was as if neither he nor his parents had ever really existed. The whole matter was quite serious, but the school did its best to handle everything discreetly. To this day, I don't know how he found out where I lived, and that's exactly what troubles me most. The prevailing theory is that he was a mentally unstable and deeply disturbed boy who, for whatever reason, developed a strange fascination with me, and that he possibly stalked me for an extended period. My parents were worried for weeks. It's something we don't talk about anymore because it's just too uncomfortable. But since then, life in this house has never really felt safe or carefree for me again. The idea that someone could watch you, learn about your life, know where you live, and plan something without you having any idea still haunts me. What bothers me most is the calculation behind it all. He didn't just randomly show up. He planned it. He got expelled, somehow got back into the school, found my yearbook, left that message, then tracked down my address. He knew about my friends, my relationships, details about my life that a stranger shouldn't know. And the way he changed when David confronted him, that instant transformation from fake friendliness to pure rage, it was like watching a mask slip off. Like he had been practicing being normal, and when it didn't work, he showed who he really was. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if we had opened that door. If my parents hadn't come downstairs when they did, if he had broken that window. The police never found him, which means he's still out there somewhere. And that message in my yearbook, "I'll see you again," feels less like a promise and more like a threat that hasn't been fulfilled yet. I work for a company that specializes in maintaining and securing foreclosed properties. Basically, that means we take care of abandoned houses, secure them, clear them out, winterize them. And sometimes we even have to board them up if there's been vandalism. It's not glamorous work, but it pays well and is usually quiet. You spend a lot of time alone in houses that once belonged to people who have long since disappeared. Sometimes it's sad, sometimes just boring. But occasionally, you come across a house that gives you a bad feeling. That's what happened in late September of 2021, when I received an assignment to clear out a property in a rural area in northern Vermont. One of those dying places, a single gas station, half the stores closed, cracked, and overgrown roads. The house itself was a single-story structure at the end of a dirt road, surrounded by dense brush and woods on 3 sides. No other houses in sight, just trees and silence. According to the file, the house had been foreclosed after the owner, an elderly woman, had died, and no heirs had claimed the property. The utilities had been shut off for over a year. Our job was to catalog the remaining possessions, empty the house, and make it winter-ready. I drove up on a Wednesday morning around 9 o'clock with a small van and my equipment. From the outside, the house looked intact. Windows closed, door locked, roof in order. Only the front yard was completely overgrown. Ivy and weeds climbed all the way up to the porch. I had to push the door open with some force because it had swollen in the frame. But inside, everything looked fairly normal. dust, stale air, faded furniture. Then suddenly my work phone rang. I was startled because I had no reception out here. I had already checked, not a single signal bar. Still, the phone was vibrating. The display showed no name, no number, just unknown caller. I answered and heard nothing, just a deep, scratchy static like weak radio interference. I said hello twice, then hung up and figured it was a technical glitch. I got to work. As always, I started with photo documentation, every room, every object. The living room was filled with old furniture, lace curtains, and framed pictures. It reminded me of my grandmother's house, heavy cabinets, doilies, porcelain figurines. The hallway didn't smell rotten, more like dust, moisture, and a hint of metal. There were 3 bedrooms. One was completely empty, except for a sagging mattress on the floor. Another was apparently a sewing room, with spools of thread everywhere and a dusty machine on the desk. I looked more closely and discovered a cork board covered with old newspaper clippings. Almost exclusively obituaries, dozens carefully cut out and precisely fastened with thumbtacks. No names I knew, all local notices. I went on to the main bedroom. On the nightstand was a rotary phone. I remember just standing there for a moment, staring at it, because I hadn't seen one in years. It was ivory-colored, yellowed with age, with a long spiral cord. A phone that would never ring again, because the line had been cut long ago. I went on to the bathroom. At exactly that moment, my cell phone rang again. Another unknown caller. This time I hesitated. I picked up the receiver, stepped out into the hallway, and answered. Again nothing, just silence. But after about 5 seconds, I heard whispering, very quiet, barely audible. "Don't answer the phone in the bedroom," it said. Then the connection was dead. I froze. My heart pounded up to my throat. The house lay in deep, oppressive silence. I checked all the windows. They were closed. No one was outside. No signs of break-ins. My first thought was a bad joke. Probably one of the other guys from the team playing a prank on me. But no one knew I was here so early, and again, no reception. I looked at my phone, 1 bar, then nothing again, as if the signal were flickering, appearing and disappearing. I tried to call my supervisor. The call failed. I decided to finish the work quickly. In the living room, I began packing loose items into boxes. Books, porcelain figurines, dusty glass. But the whole time I felt watched. My gaze kept wandering to the hallway, as if I expected to see someone standing there. Then it rang for the 3rd time. But this time it wasn't my cell phone. It was the rotary phone in the bedroom. I heard it from the other end of the house, a shrill, mechanical ringing that echoed through the rooms. This phone wasn't supposed to work anymore. The line was dead. There was no service, no connection, and yet it was ringing like an old-fashioned bell. Slowly I walked down the hallway, my cell phone still in my hand. The ringing repeated over and over. I stepped into the doorframe. The phone lay on the nightstand. The receiver vibrated slightly with each ring. No way I was answering that call. Finally, the phone fell silent. I backed away, stepped out of the room. I just wanted to get out. But part of my assignment was to completely secure the house. The basement also had to be checked. I was about to abandon everything, but something held me back. Maybe it was pride. Maybe I just didn't want to admit how scared I was. The basement door was in the kitchen. I opened it slowly. The steps creaked under my footsteps as I descended with the flashlight. It smelled of mold and something that reminded me of rusty metal. Shelves lined the wall, filled with old paint cans and broken furniture. In the far corner stood a small table with a cordless phone on it, a more modern model made of gray plastic, covered with a thick layer of dust. Next to it lay a stack of yellowed notebooks. I picked one up, opened it, and flipped through the pages. On each page was a name, a date, and a short sentence. Linda H., July 15th, 2019. Rang once, didn't answer. Carl M., September 23rd, 2019. Answered, warned. And so it went. Dozens of entries. The notebook fell from my hand, and with it, my heart seemed to plummet through my body as I slowly looked around. The basement gave me the oppressive feeling of not being alone down there, convinced that someone was watching me from a dark corner. This drove me up the stairs in panic, constantly looking over my shoulder, heart pounding up to my throat. I didn't finish the assignment. Instead, I drove straight back to the office and filed my report. I didn't tell the whole truth, just that the property was unsafe and had possibly been entered by squatters or unauthorized persons. 2 days later, I received a message from a colleague, Marcus. He had been assigned to finish the house. I hadn't told him in detail what had happened. His message read, "The phone in the bedroom that has no connection rang while I was there." What the hell? I immediately called his work phone. He told me he hadn't answered the receiver. He was too scared. The next day, Marcus quit without notice and never came back. He's not dead, I should mention. I looked him up on Facebook later, and yes, he's been posting now and then since. But I never spoke to him again. I don't know what else he saw in that house, but it must have been bad enough to turn him away from this job forever. My boss finally called the police to report the possible squatters after Marcus quit, but the officers found no one in the house. Everything about that place, from the isolated location to the eerie, decaying interior to the calls on my phone, that voice on the line, and the cursed phone that rang despite a dead connection, felt like something out of a real horror movie. I swear it could only be one of two things: a sick, elaborately staged prank or an equally carefully prepared trap. But the more I think about it, the more I lean toward something else entirely. Something that doesn't have a rational explanation. Because here's what really gets to me: those notebooks in the basement, all those names and dates. I looked up some of those names later, the ones from the local obituaries on the cork board upstairs. Linda H. died 3 days after that July entry. Carl M. disappeared in October 2019. A month after his entry said he answered, warned. The police never told us what they found in that house, but I have my suspicions. The way that phone could ring without any connection, the way my cell phone got calls with no signal, the detailed records in those notebooks, someone or something was using that house as a hunting ground. And the most terrifying part, when I looked up the property records later, I found out the elderly woman who supposedly died there, she never existed. The house had been empty for over 5 years. No owner, no death, no foreclosure. Someone had created fake paperwork to get maintenance crews like us to come out there alone. I quit that job 3 weeks later, but sometimes, late at night, my phone still rings with no caller ID, and I never, ever answer. I grew up in coastal Maine, and every summer since I can remember, I spent 3 months in a classic New England seaside town. If you know the area, you know exactly what I'm talking about. I had a large group of friends who did the same thing every year. And after our respective summer jobs, we'd spend afternoons and evenings pulling various pranks and adventures. When this happened, I was 20 years old, like most of my friends, and had just finished my shift as a marina hand. Like any other evening, I sent a message to the group asking about plans and picked up my friend, let's call him Connor, to get alcohol. He was the one with the fake ID. After we bought supplies, we returned to our little hometown. We decided to go out on my family's boat, which I was allowed to pilot alone, and drink a few beers while we waited for the rest. We drove around the small peninsula, where we lived, to a spot where other boats often anchored and people gathered. Several boats were already there, and although it was already about 7 in the evening, that wasn't unusual. We found a spot between 2 boats, dropped anchor, and settled in. Music from the boat to our left drifted over to us as we relaxed, drinking and enjoying the atmosphere. Then the boat to our right suddenly pulled away, and shortly after, the music from the remaining boat stopped too. We figured they'd be leaving soon as well, and Connor and I, already fairly drunk, began loudly groaning and shouting for them to turn the music back on so the party could continue, accompanied by all the usual drunken nonsense. But nothing happened. We sat up front on the bow, continued drinking, when Connor suddenly said, "Dude, look." I turned around, looked at the boat, and saw 3 figures standing at the edge, motionless, their gaze fixed on us. At first I had to laugh, drunk as I was, and turned away again. But Connor kept staring, unwavering. I admit, I don't have a particularly good sense of danger. I tend to take things optimistically and lightly, but Connor was obviously troubled. I told him not to drive himself crazy. Probably the people just wanted to get a better look at us, or something like that. But he wouldn't take his eyes off them, his face tense and uneasy. Something I didn't really understand at the moment. It was pretty dark by now. Only the light from their boat illuminated the area, so you couldn't tell who they were. Only their silhouettes stood out against the light. I tried for several minutes to get Connor to relax. Finally, I turned around again, and they were still standing there in exactly the same position, still staring at us. I thought it was a joke, grabbed the megaphone from the compartment next to the steering wheel, and called out, $20 for watching, guys." Connor was visibly annoyed by this. He had a bad feeling. I was about to put the megaphone back when one of them started laughing. Clearly a man, but something was wrong with that laugh. It sounded deep and scratchy, somehow malicious. At that moment, I felt unease for the first time myself. Connor suddenly stood up and said, "Let's get the hell out of here, man. This isn't normal." But I waved him off, just said everything was fine. But in the next moment, we heard 2 distinct splashes from their direction, and only one silhouette could be seen on their boat. That immediately caused Connor to frantically haul in the anchor, while I was still laughing about the situation and about him, which in retrospect was incredibly stupid. He called for me to finally start the engine while I was still drinking beer and barely containing my laughter as he pulled up the anchor. I was so absorbed in my laughter that I didn't even notice the sounds in the water next to our boat. The quiet, steady swimming of 2 bodies. Connor paused, anchor in his hands, and looked at me, which made me pause too. We couldn't see into the water. Too dark, no lighting from the boat. I called out, "Hello," but there was no answer. Even the splashing stopped abruptly. Then quite suddenly, I heard Connor scream, "Shit," at the same time as the sound of water splashing directly behind me. I spun around and saw someone trying to climb over the stern onto our boat. I panicked completely, hastily turned the ignition key, and in the corner of my eye saw a hand clawing at the side railing, right next to Connor, who had raised the anchor in a fighting stance. Finally, the engine started, and I instinctively gunned it at full throttle. We crashed head-on into the sandbar in front of us. I immediately put it in reverse and steered at top speed backward out of the bay, out into open water. Then I put the engine in neutral. Connor and I just looked at each other silently before he started in with his, "I told you so, and you idiot." I completely agreed with him and said, "Let's go back." He was fine with that. In retrospect, we should have driven straight back to the docks near my house. But for some reason, we decided instead to collect all the things that had flown overboard during our hasty escape. We weren't even finished when I noticed the lights of a boat in the direction we had just come from, and it was approaching quickly. I just said, "Damn, that can't be," jumped back to the helm and gunned it. Our boat is old, so not exactly built for speed, and although I got everything out of the engine, they caught up fast. Connor was slowly losing his composure and muttering, "Who are these guys? What do they want? Can't they just let us chill on the water in peace?" I told him to calm down and concentrated on heading straight for the docks. After about 5 minutes, we could see the marina, but the boat behind us was now so close that we could clearly see the bow rising and falling on the waves. I honestly didn't know what to do. I yanked the wheel hard to the left and maneuvered the boat as close to shore as possible without running aground. And as if by miracle, the other boat turned in the opposite direction. We breathed a sigh of relief, but I kept the throttle fully open and steered back to the docks at top speed. After we docked and were relieved to find that the boat had taken no damage, we met up with our friends and told them what had happened. In doing so, we developed some theories. Maybe they wanted to rob us. Maybe they wanted to steal the boat. We didn't recognize the boat, so they probably weren't from here. I don't know, and honestly, I don't want to think about what could have happened. I'm just glad we never had to find out. What I do know is that I'm grateful Connor was there. Without his suspicion, the night might have turned out very differently, and for the worse. But here's what still haunts me. We found out later from Harbor Patrol that 3 bodies had been pulled from the water near where we anchored, about 2 weeks before our encounter. They'd been missing for months. The boat we saw that night. It had been reported stolen from a marina 60 miles north. Someone was using that stolen boat, and those weren't random people trying to board us. They were hunting, and we were just lucky enough to get away before we became their next victims, floating face down in the dark water. I work for a company that handles property preservation for banks and mortgage companies. When houses go into foreclosure, we're the ones who secure them, document everything inside, and prepare them for resale. It's not exciting work, but it's steady. And most of the time you're dealing with normal stuff, abandoned furniture, unpaid bills scattered around, maybe some minor vandalism. But sometimes you walk into a place that just feels wrong from the moment you step inside. This happened in early March of 2022. I got called out to a ranch house in rural upstate New York, about 2 hours north of Albany. The kind of place where cell service is spotty and your GPS starts acting up. The house sat at the end of a long gravel driveway. Surrounded by bare trees and fields that stretched to the horizon. According to my paperwork, the previous owner had died intestate with no next of kin, and the property had sat empty for almost 18 months. Standard case, catalog personal effects, secure the premises, make it ready for the bank to list. I pulled up around 10 in the morning. The house looked normal enough from outside. White vinyl siding, green shutters, small front porch with a couple of dead plants in pots. The key was where the property manager said it would be, under a fake rock by the front steps. Inside, everything was covered in that particular kind of dust that only comes from a house being closed up for months. The air was stale and heavy. Living room had an old plaid couch, wood grain television from the 80s, walls covered with family photos of people I'd never meet. I was about halfway through photographing the front rooms when my phone rang. Surprised me because, like I said, reception out here was terrible. I'd already checked when I arrived, maybe one bar if I held it just right. But there it was, buzzing in my pocket. No caller ID, just showed unknown number. I answered, but the line was dead. Just that empty silence you get sometimes with bad connections. Figured it was a dropped call and went back to work. The kitchen was pretty standard, old appliances, dishes still in the sink from whoever lived here last. But then I noticed something odd. On the counter next to the phone was a notebook, open to a page covered with phone numbers. Not contacts or anything organized like that. Just numbers scrawled everywhere, some crossed out, some circled, like someone had been desperately trying to reach people. I flipped through a few pages. Same thing on every page, phone numbers, dates, sometimes a word or two next to them. No answer, disconnected, wrong number. The handwriting got more frantic toward the end of the notebook, like whoever was writing was running out of time. That's when my phone rang again. Same unknown number. This time when I answered, I could hear something in the background. Not voices exactly, but a sound like static interference, or maybe whined through a bad connection. "Hello," I said. Nothing for about 10 seconds, then a voice very faint. "You shouldn't be there." The line went dead before I could respond. I looked at my phone, no signal bars at all now. Tried calling back, but the call wouldn't go through. I should have left right then. That's what my gut was telling me, but I had a job to finish, and I'd never left a property incomplete before. Pride, I guess, or stupidity. The bedrooms were at the back of the house. First one was obviously a guest room, single bed, dresser, not much else. But the master bedroom was where things got really strange. On the nightstand was an old rotary phone, the kind with the heavy handset and cloth cord. Cream-colored plastic gone yellow with age. And here's the thing, this phone was plugged into the wall. In a house that had been without power for over a year. I was standing there looking at it when my cell phone rang for the third time. Same unknown number. But before I could answer, the rotary phone started ringing too. That old-fashioned bell sound, mechanical and loud in the dead silence of the house. My phone went to voicemail, but the old phone kept ringing. I stared at it, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The power was off. The phone service had been disconnected 18 months ago. There was no way that phone should work. But it was ringing. I walked over to the nightstand, reached for the handset, then stopped. Something in my gut said don't. Instead, I just stood there listening to it ring. After maybe 20 rings, it stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the ringing. I went back to the kitchen to grab my equipment bag and get out of there. But as I was packing up, I noticed the notebook again. This time I really looked at it. The dates went back almost 2 years, but they stopped abruptly 18 months ago. The last entry was just one line, written in shaky handwriting. "They're calling back." That's when I heard footsteps in the basement. Slow, deliberate steps on creaky floorboards, like someone pacing back and forth. I froze, listening. The steps would go one direction, pause, then come back, over and over. I should have run, should have gotten in my truck and driven away and let someone else deal with whatever was happening in that house. But I'm an idiot, and I was curious. The basement door was off the kitchen. It was standing slightly open, just a crack, but enough to see the wooden steps disappearing into darkness below. The footsteps had stopped, but I could hear something else now. A sound like whispering, too faint to make out words. I opened the door wider and called down. "Hello, is someone there?" The whispering stopped immediately. Complete silence from below. I should have closed the door and left. Instead, I turned on my phone's flashlight and started down the steps. Each one creaked under my weight, way too loud in the silence. The basement was unfinished, concrete floor, exposed ceiling joists, walls lined with metal shelving. But in the far corner, I could see a desk with something on it. As I got closer, I realized it was another phone. Newer than the one upstairs, a cordless model from maybe the 90s. Next to it were more notebooks, stacked 3 deep. I opened the top one and immediately wished I hadn't. Page after page of phone numbers, but these were different from the ones upstairs. These had names next to them, real names with addresses and notes. Sarah Chen answered on 3rd ring, told her she needed to leave town. She hung up. Mike Torres wouldn't listen, called me crazy. Found his obituary 2 weeks later. Jennifer Walsh believed me, moved away that same night. Smart girl. I flipped through page after page of the same thing. Someone had been calling people, warning them about something. And based on the notes, some listened and some didn't. The ones who didn't listen seemed to end up dead. The last entry was dated 18 months ago, the same time the house was supposed to have been abandoned. No one left to warn. The line is spreading. If someone finds this, don't answer the phone. That's when the cordless phone on the desk started ringing. I backed away from it like it was a snake. The phone shouldn't have worked, no power, no phone service, no way for it to receive calls. But there it was, ringing in the darkness of that basement. I ran, dropped my equipment bag, left half my photos unfinished, and ran up those stairs faster than I'd ever moved in my life. Behind me, the phone kept ringing. I made it to my truck and was 2 miles down the road before I realized I was holding my breath. My hands were shaking so bad I had to pull over. When I got back to the office, I filed the shortest report of my career. Property unsafe due to structural issues. Recommend further inspection before proceeding. I never told my supervisor what really happened. Who would believe me? But here's the thing that still keeps me awake at night. 3 days later, my phone rang. Unknown number. When I answered, there was just silence for a few seconds, then that same faint voice. "You found the notebooks." I hung up and changed my number the next day. But sometimes, late at night, my new phone rings with no caller ID. And I never answer because I remember what that last notebook entry said. The line is spreading, and now it has my number too. worked the night shift at a distribution warehouse in Phoenix, Arizona. It's a sprawling facility dedicated to shipping operations, and most of my job involves conducting inventory checks, making sure every package and item is properly cataloged and tracked throughout the sorting process. Sometimes a colleague shares the same schedule as me, but most nights I'm completely alone. That particular Tuesday night in October was no exception. I arrived at the warehouse around 11 p.m. and checked in with my supervisor, who locked up the facility before leaving me to handle things solo. I started my usual routine, verifying the deliveries that had come in during the day. About an hour into my shift, I walked past a door that was slightly ajar. It appeared to have been closed but not fully latched, so it was sticking out just a bit from the frame. This door led to the back of the building, where truck drivers typically access the loading docks. I opened it to take a look outside. The area behind the warehouse was silent and deserted, nothing particularly noteworthy. I assumed my supervisor had simply forgotten to lock it properly. Since I didn't have keys for this type of side access, I couldn't lock it myself, and honestly, it didn't seem like a big concern to me at the time. I closed it and returned to my inventory work. I was making good progress, moving quickly through the aisles, when something in my peripheral vision caught my attention. At the far end of the corridor, I immediately looked up but saw nothing. What I thought I'd glimpsed out of the corner of my eye looked like a silhouette running across the back of the hallway. I told myself my mind was playing tricks on me, but my heart started beating faster anyway. I shook my head, rubbing my eyes, wondering what was happening to me. I hesitated about going to check, but eventually decided against it, telling myself it would waste time, and that I was 99% certain it was nothing. This kind of illusion happens often. You think you see something out of the corner of your eye, but when you look directly, there's nothing there. Why would this time be any different? Yet, as the minutes passed, a slight uneasiness crept over me. What if someone really had been there? Sighing, slightly annoyed at letting myself get troubled like this, I decided to go check the end of the corridor. It was an area I rarely frequented since it wasn't part of my regular duties. It was filled with pallets ready to be shipped. Since I never worked in that section, most of the lights were turned off. I stood in the hallway, peering into the large, dark room for a few seconds, hoping to spot any movement, but nothing stirred. I returned to my post and resumed my work. I don't know if it was that episode that affected me, but I was suddenly overwhelmed by a wave of fatigue. A brutal weariness washed over me, slowing me down considerably. However, I wanted to finish this section before taking a break, so I continued working. But barely 5 minutes later, I saw something again out of the corner of my eye. I turned my head sharply toward the end of the corridor. I could have sworn I glimpsed a figure crouched behind a corner, as if someone was watching me. But again, there was nothing there. This time I immediately dropped what I was doing and rushed to the end of the hallway. Once again, darkness reigned, and I could see absolutely nothing. I called out, not really expecting an answer, but thinking it was worth a try. "Is someone there?" I waited a few moments, then stepped into the room. The silence was so complete that each of my footsteps echoed throughout the entire warehouse. I stopped halfway, scanning my surroundings. As I stood there, a strange, almost oppressive sensation crept over me, the feeling of being watched without being able to spot anyone. This only intensified my unease. I hurried back toward the other end of the corridor before casting one last glance behind me. The darkness in that room chilled my blood. I was about to resume my work when suddenly a loud, deafening noise rang out throughout the entire warehouse. The sound was metallic, like someone violently striking one of the large steel shelving units. Then heavy silence settled in, only disturbed by faint echoes still resonating through the space before another dull noise rang out, more discreet this time, like repeated tapping against the metal structure. It was as if someone was trying to get my attention, to lure me back into that room shrouded in darkness. But now certain that it was an individual and seized with absolute terror, I fled. I rushed toward the back door and ran out to the parking lot. Once I was at what I considered a safe distance, I called for help. I wasn't expecting much from the police, at least not immediately, but against all expectations, when they entered the warehouse, they discovered a man crouched behind one of the large shelves in the darkness. He was a man in his 40s, with a disheveled appearance and a deeply disturbing aspect. But the most unsettling discovery came when examining the security camera recordings. He had been seen prowling around the building multiple times during the previous week, testing each door to check if any had been left open. All those nights, I had been alone inside, sometimes just a few steps away from where he was hiding. From what little I could see when the police escorted him out of the warehouse to their car, he appeared deeply unstable, almost deranged. I don't know if they ever figured out what he was really trying to do, but just imagining that he was attempting to lure me into that room still gives me chills. When I was in college in Denver, I worked part-time during night shifts at my parents' 24/7 laundromat. It was a small, somewhat run-down establishment located on the outskirts of town. I'd always found the building surprisingly unsettling for what it was. There was something disturbing about the age of the place, the constant murmur of machines running that gave the location a troubling atmosphere. Despite this, I much preferred working at a business owned by my family rather than elsewhere. That evening was a Friday, the only day of the week when I worked a full shift from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. I took over from my father, who had left me some snacks in the back room and reminded me, as usual, not to hesitate to call him if I had any problems. There were still a few customers coming in sporadically during the following hour, so I stayed behind the counter to make sure everything went smoothly. Around midnight, the laundromat was empty, all the machines at a standstill. I remained seated behind the counter for about 15 more minutes, absorbed in my phone, putting off the moment to start cleaning tasks. That's when a man entered. I looked up, surprised. He had nothing with him, no bag, no laundry to wash, and wore a large hooded sweatshirt pulled down over his head, hands deeply buried in his pockets. I greeted him, but he didn't look at me and didn't respond. He slowly walked through the aisles of washers and dryers, glancing here and there, before returning toward the entrance and leaving without a word. I watched him as he exited into the parking lot. He didn't get into any car, didn't seem to be waiting for anyone. He simply crossed the street and disappeared. It's not common to see someone enter a laundromat like that in the middle of the night with no apparent purpose, just to wander among the machines. Technically, he hadn't done anything wrong, but the atmosphere he left behind made me deeply uncomfortable. Being alone didn't help. I think if there had been other customers, I would have felt safer. Maybe I wouldn't have even noticed anything unusual. Having nothing else to do, I started my cleaning tasks. While wiping down counters and tidying up, I thought about what could have prompted this man to enter and walk around like that. The only explanation that came to mind was that maybe he was looking for a piece of clothing he had lost earlier in the day. That seemed unlikely, especially since he hadn't asked me anything. For the next 20 minutes, I continued cleaning, my mind still occupied with this strange visit. Then at one point, I looked up and there, standing right in front of the glass entrance, was that man again. It took me several moments to realize it was actually a human silhouette behind the glass, as he was dressed all in black, and the night enveloped him. By the time I understood, he had already moved away. How long had he been standing there watching me without me seeing him? I approached the door to try to follow him with my gaze, but he had vanished. I had no idea where he had gone. His appearance, this almost spectral way of appearing without warning, it all chilled me. I considered calling my father for a moment, but the idea of waking him up and making him come back to work because of a man who was simply a bit suspicious made me feel guilty. I knew he wouldn't have blamed me, but I was only in my first few months at this job, and I wanted to prove I was trustworthy. So I stayed on guard for nearly an hour, stationed behind the counter with my gaze fixed on the windows. But the more time passed, the more my attention relaxed, especially since no other customers entered. I picked up my phone again, trying to kill time, when I suddenly heard slight creaking sounds coming from the back of the building. I stood up and took a few steps toward the back room, listening carefully. I could hear sounds of movement, as if someone was shifting objects in one of the back rooms. It took me only a few seconds to understand that someone was back there, and that I needed to leave. I turned around and headed discreetly toward the front door, ready to call the police while pressing on it to exit. But it remained blocked, impossible to open. I looked down and saw through the glass that an object had been wrapped around the handles on the outside. I immediately understood. This was what the man had been doing outside when he stood by the door watching me. A wave of panic overwhelmed me. There was only one exit left, the back door. I started moving silently toward the rear, still hearing the movement sounds in the back room. Muffled, careful sounds, as if he was trying not to be noticed. Reaching the threshold, I spotted him. He had his back to me, kneeling and searching through boxes placed on the floor. Then I saw the exit. This was my moment. I started running toward the door. The man immediately turned around and our eyes met. I reached the exit, but my heart sank. A makeshift rope was tied around the handle, as if he had tried to seal it. Fortunately for me, his improvised system hadn't held, and I managed to force it open to escape. Barely outside, the man emerged as well, but now out in the open, he didn't pursue me. He simply fled. My father and the police arrived quickly, but there were few leads about where he might have disappeared. It was clear this man had tried to trap me inside with him. I suppose he wanted to do it discreetly. But in searching for something to block the exit door, he had given me the opportunity to escape. His intentions were undoubtedly terrifying, and even today, when I replay that night in my head, I have trouble believing I only realized the danger at the very last moment. Since then, I'm infinitely more vigilant when working alone, never again trusting anyone based on appearance alone. because if that man had succeeded in sealing that door, I would have had no way out. For several years, I held a data entry position at a private company in Chicago. It was a menial, undervalued job that was looked down upon with a certain condescension in the office. Supervisors constantly added extra tasks that had nothing to do with the official function. But I was young, and it was my first real job, so I complied without protest. The offices were located on the 7th and top floor of a large office building nestled in a small business district on the outskirts of the city. Our company only occupied this top floor, while the lower floors were rented by other companies. As far as I knew, these companies were all service-oriented, and their premises emptied around 5 or 6 p.m. We were the only ones who sometimes stayed later. Being the one assigned all the thankless tasks, I often found myself working overtime alone in the offices. I earned the lowest salary, so making me stay after closing didn't cost the management much. That evening, my supervisor gave me a long list of things to do. He didn't even ask if I could stay. He assumed I would. And faithful to my docile temperament at the time, I didn't protest. The extra money was always welcome. And in the calm of the office emptied of its occupants, I appreciated the work more without the constant pressure of being watched or directed. At 6 p.m., everyone left. I remained alone at my post, continuing to work. 30 minutes later, the main building lights went out, leaving only the dimmed energy-saving mode lighting. I worked at my own pace, concentrated in front of the screen. 3 hours passed like this, in an atmosphere of absolute silence, when a noise suddenly caught my attention. A muffled sound from below, difficult to locate in this immense building where everything echoed. It sounded like a door being opened or closed. I looked up from my screen, listening for a few moments, hearing nothing more. I simply resumed my work. I didn't pay it any more attention. I imagined it was simply the building creaking, as it sometimes does at night. Time passed another 30, maybe 45 minutes. I had practically finished what I had to do. I had about an hour of work left before I could go home. It was late, and I felt fatigue taking hold of me. I stood up to make myself a small coffee at the machine placed near the entrance. Walking toward the machine, I didn't notice anything abnormal, but returning to my desk with cup in hand, something caught my attention. The door at the back, the one leading to the hallway, was ajar. This door only led to a utility closet and the stairwell going down to other floors. It was usually always closed. No one ever used it. Intrigued, I approached and poked my head through the opening. The 2 doors I could see, those of the closet and the stairwell, were closed, showing no sign of passage. Yet a shiver ran through me, accompanied by a feeling of discomfort. I attributed this to the weak and gloomy lighting of this hallway at night. The place took on a sinister appearance. I advanced to the stairwell door to take a look, just to make sure there was nothing abnormal, then returned inside and carefully closed the door behind me before returning to my post. I only had an hour left to hold on. If I finished this work quickly, I could go home, and all this would just be a brief, unimportant oddity. But that open door remained a troubling enigma. I knew there was no valid reason for someone to come up here, much less without announcing themselves. I tried as best I could to get back into my work, striving to finish it as quickly as possible, but it was difficult. Every 2 or 3 minutes, an oppressive sensation crossed my mind, the intimate conviction of being watched. I would then look up from my screen, scanning the room with my gaze without ever seeing anything. This was starting to seriously disturb me because I felt my concentration eroding, slowing down the advancement of my tasks. But the impression was so intense that I couldn't help but look up each time. This lasted about half an hour until the moment when, while my eyes were riveted to the screen, everything went dark around me. The dimmed ceiling lights suddenly stopped working, plunging me into total darkness. Only the pale glow of the computer screen remained, drawing a pale circle around me. Everything else was nothing but opaque shadows. I immediately turned my head toward the other end of the room, where the light switches were located. I stood up, ready to rush there, but I froze before even taking a step. In the absolute silence of the building, I perceived muffled sounds. The slow, measured rhythm of footsteps advancing from that direction, crossing one by one the meters that still separated me from the darkness. Someone was approaching, emerging from the shadows, skirting the light projected by the screen. I remained paralyzed for a few seconds, terrified, until adrenaline took over. I leaped from my desk and headed straight for the stairwell door. I crossed the hallway and reached the stairwell, finally bathed in reassuring light. I didn't stop running until I reached the ground floor, where I escaped from the building. I immediately dialed the emergency number. I stayed planted outside, shivering in the cold for nearly 15 minutes before an officer arrived. Then another 5 minutes passed before 2 other officers joined him, and they finally began searching the building. But by then, they found no one inside. The most frustrating thing is that it took 2 days to obtain the security camera footage, which wasn't very useful. The outdated system, more than 30 years old, only broadcast a blurry, extremely pixelated black and white image, making any identification impossible. All they could determine was that an individual had entered the building around 7 p.m., claiming to have an appointment with one of the other companies. He had then immediately hidden in the utility closet, waiting for everyone to leave except me. He had wandered around the hallways for a while until he noticed my persistent presence. From there, his intentions remained unclear. Was he simply trying to make me flee, or did he harbor more sinister designs? For lack of a satisfactory explanation, I decided to resign shortly after. I never regretted this choice for many reasons, but the most important remains never having to find myself alone in that building again, knowing that this man, to this day, has never been found. Craigslist wasn't a service I used frequently, in truth, less than once a year certainly. But sometimes it was simply the easiest way to sell an item that would otherwise have been impossible to move quickly. However, after what happened to me about 3 years ago in Portland, Oregon, I've never used it again. I was 22 at the time and living in a small house with a roommate for over a year before he moved out. The lease was ending in a few months anyway, and without a roommate to share the rent, I couldn't afford to stay. So I had to leave too. Finding an apartment wasn't too difficult, but it was much smaller than the house. This meant I had to get rid of practically all my furniture. The couch in particular was almost new, my roommate, and I had bought it barely a year earlier when he moved in. It would be a total waste to simply leave it on the sidewalk for a stranger to take. It had cost a lot, and any extra income would have been useful for the move. So I naturally turned to Craigslist. It was the first time I was selling something on the site. I had always been on the buyer's side. I had never had a strange experience, except perhaps the slight unease you sometimes feel when entering a stranger's home. But this time, as a seller, I felt more comfortable since the transaction was to take place at my place. It took a little over 2 weeks before someone genuinely interested responded to the ad and asked to come see the couch. He then called me to ask some questions about it. Honestly, this reassured me. I assumed he simply wanted to make sure I wasn't some sketchy guy. His name was Marcus. He explained that he had just moved into a new house and was looking for inexpensive furniture to furnish it. I told him I was in the opposite situation, leaving a house for an apartment. He politely asked why I was moving, and I explained that my roommate had left and I could no longer afford the rent. He seemed nice, which probably prompted me to tell him more than necessary. We agreed on an appointment for a Saturday evening around 6 p.m. after our respective work hours. When the time came, I left the front door slightly open and sat on the couch to wait for him. I stayed seated for over an hour, watching for his arrival before closing the door, thinking he had simply canceled without warning. I then went to the kitchen to prepare something to eat, but a few minutes later the doorbell rang. It was then 7:30, and I was obviously a bit annoyed, but I tried to put on a facade smile when opening the door. "Hi, I'm Marcus," he said, extending his hand for a handshake. He was a tall, heavy-set man with a broad smile on his lips. I shook his hand and invited him in, guiding him to the living room. He observed the couch for a moment, nodding approvingly, when suddenly I heard footsteps outside. The door opened, letting in 2 other men. "Sorry, these are my buddies who are moving in with me. I hope you don't mind," he said. "Oh, no problem," I replied with a hesitant voice, although I knew very well I didn't really have a choice. Honestly, I was starting to feel really uncomfortable with a bad feeling in the pit of my stomach. I tried to convince myself I was imagining things, but this sensation persisted. Marcus went to the other side of the couch and leaned down as if examining something, then straightened up. "Right there," he said, pointing to a spot on the side of the couch. The 2 other men had moved closer, standing behind me while Marcus stood behind my back. Reluctantly, I approached the spot he was pointing to and leaned down to look. "I don't see anything," I said. He insisted, pointing to the spot as if he wanted me to crouch down further. The 2 men then positioned themselves right in front of me while Marcus remained behind. I slowly knelt down to get a better look, still seeing nothing. I felt their breath on the back of my neck, which made me both powerless and terrified. "I was just teasing you. There's nothing there at all," Marcus exclaimed, brutally slapping my back as I stood up. I let out a nervous laugh and took a few steps back. I then noticed the malicious smiles on the faces of the other 2, who exchanged a knowing look with Marcus as if they were preparing something. I did my best to stay calm and look for an escape from this situation, but they were already in my house. I couldn't simply leave, and I was far too terrified to ask them to go. "So do you like it?" I asked, trying to speed things up. Marcus exchanged a look with his friends, then turned his eyes back to me. His jovial face had darkened, his smile had disappeared. A strange silence settled in, suspended like an omen while I stared into the emptiness of his eyes, the calm before the storm. One of the men suddenly threw himself on me, violently tackling me to the ground. My immediate reflex was to resist, but his strength overwhelmed me, and I quickly gave up, hoping only not to be further mistreated. Marcus and the other accomplice scattered throughout the house, methodically pillaging everything of value, sowing disorder in each room. The man on top of me maintained his grip brutally, pressing my head against the hard floor under the weight of his entire body. After a few minutes, I heard Marcus shout from the entrance. The man immediately got up and fled from the house at full speed. I heard the sound of their truck starting up and racing away while I remained lying there, paralyzed between pain, stupor, and fear. After a moment, I managed to sit up painfully and dragged myself to the door to close and lock it. I called the police shortly after. Unsurprisingly, the name Marcus was fake, as was the email address and phone number, which wasn't linked to any real identity. The investigators collected some fingerprints in the house, took photos of footprints left on the floor, but the investigation stagnated without the slightest suspect. The only lead they could establish was that these fingerprints matched those found in another house that had been burglarized a few weeks earlier under similar circumstances. That victim also lived alone. We suspect these individuals deliberately target isolated people, which means I somehow signed my own arrest warrant by revealing that my roommate had left. Whatever the case, this experience deeply marked me. It left me with a heavy burden of stress and anger. I let myself be blinded by the feeling of security that a home provides, and I was betrayed because of it. Platforms like Craigslist can prove dangerous, and everyone should be much more vigilant before opening their door to strangers who appear harmless. A few years ago, I tried to buy a pickup truck on Craigslist in Sacramento, and before you say anything, the price was exceptional, and my financial situation was frankly not great. I had never used this site before, but I knew it was a fairly common place to sell your stuff, often at low prices. Even with the advantageous rates, I didn't have the few $1,000s needed in my account, and had to ask for financial help from my father. After spending time scrolling through ads, I contacted a man who was offering his truck for $4,000. He responded quickly, answering all my questions in a way that seemed honest. He basically told me it wasn't a high-end vehicle, but that it was reliable and did the job. Interested, he agreed that we could meet at a McDonald's located halfway between our two homes. I arrived first by Uber, and he joined me about 5 minutes later. We talked a bit. He gave me more details about the vehicle, mentioning some small past problems, nothing too serious. Anyway, I wasn't in a position to be picky. Of course, I asked to do a test drive, and he replied that he knew a quieter parking lot nearby where I could test the truck. Honestly, I shrugged, ready to follow him, and I took out my phone to call an Uber, but he assured me it was just across the street, that we could just go there together. I didn't want to seem impolite, and since I had never experienced this kind of situation, I assumed it was a usual thing. In hindsight, I should have told him to go screw himself, but I was young and he was older, which for some reason inspired a certain confidence in me. Once in the vehicle, he asked if I had my license on me, one more detail that reassured me. He seemed sincere. He started up, but instead of simply crossing the street, he drove several blocks to a deserted parking lot away from the main road. First real alarm signal, even though there should have been several before. "Let's switch places," he said, putting the vehicle in neutral as we made a loop around the parking lot. As we walked around the truck to switch places, he threw me the keys saying, "Careful." But they landed far from me. I would have had to dive headfirst onto the concrete to catch them. Embarrassed, I bent down to pick them up, and the moment I leaned over, I felt his foot strike violently against my side. In an instant, he was on me, pulling my wallet from my back pocket before running toward the truck. I immediately grabbed the keys from the ground, thinking he had forgotten them in the panic, and that I might be able to negotiate an exchange. But of course, they were fake. He started the truck and drove away, leaving me there alone and stupid. What makes it even worse is that everything happened so fast that I didn't even have time to note the damn license plate. I still had my phone, fortunately, and the first thing I did was block my only bank card to prevent him from spending money I didn't even have. Then I called the police. I returned to McDonald's and filed a complaint when they arrived, but with only clues like an old, rusty white truck and the description of an average middle-aged white man with no distinguishing features. The case never went anywhere. The ad had disappeared. The email address was fake, simply inspired by a video game character. And of course I hadn't noted the plate. In summary, I lost $4,000 in cash, had to wait for a new bank card, redo my license, and the scammer was never found. The lesson to learn: don't use Craigslist and don't be as naive as I was. I used to work for a large cleaning service company in Seattle, but I quit after a former colleague told me she was earning more than 3 times my salary working alone by simply posting ads on Craigslist Marketplace. Obviously, I decided to check it out and ended up launching myself as well. For nearly 6 months, I was earning very well until a strange event turned everything upside down. Since that day, I've never encountered anyone as disturbing, and I hope never to relive such an experience. I had responded to a very ordinary email from a man wanting me to come clean his house. Generally, clients tell me which rooms they want cleaned, and I establish a rate based on the estimated time required. For this, I either have to go on site to evaluate the work, or they send me a walkthrough video. This is the method we used in my old company, except I offer much more attractive rates, and people appreciate the regularity of seeing the same person each week. The man had therefore sent me a video of his interior, which already looked very clean, which often happens with clients concerned with maintaining impeccable cleanliness and wanting attention to the smallest details. We set a date and time, and a few days later, I went to do this first cleaning. I was supposed to spend about 3.5 hours there, covering the 2 floors of the house excluding the basement, with particular care given to the kitchen and bathroom tiles. He welcomed me at the door and led me upstairs so I could start there. That's when everything started to deteriorate. I got to work, thinking he would leave to go about his business, but instead he stayed planted there watching me. This has happened to me before with elderly and authoritative female clients, but he wasn't looking at what I was cleaning. It was me he was staring at. I asked him if he wanted me to take care of something else, but he remained silent for a few seconds. "You know, when I saw your ad on Craigslist, I knew I had to have you." At first, I didn't interpret this as an inappropriate remark. I just thought it was one of those white men of a certain age who found it natural for a Mexican woman to be made for this kind of work. I didn't make a big deal of it. I'd heard much worse. And so as not to compromise my income, I was content to feign a smile. Well, thank you, but I generally ask people not to stay in the room. It's easier to work. He nodded, but obviously this didn't suit him because, if he left the room, it was to go sit on the bed just across the hall where he could continue watching me. At this point, I was really starting to feel uncomfortable. The idea of him staring at me like this for more than 3 hours chilled my blood. I then had an idea. After dusting, I started vacuuming, maneuvering behind the door to partially close it, leaving it just slightly ajar so that at least in this room he could no longer see me. I told myself I just had to hold on today, finish the job, get paid, and never come back. I then moved on to the adjoining bathroom. About 20 minutes later, while I was scrubbing tile grout, I felt a gaze on me again. I turned around, and of course he was there in the doorway. "Sorry to bother you. I forgot to tell you not to touch the vanity. It was my wife's. She died in 2009. It was very difficult to live through, so I prefer it to remain as she left it." I nodded, and after a heavy silence punctuated by a strange look, he finally turned on his heels. I wondered why he hadn't simply specified in the instructions not to touch this vanity if he cared about it so much. But while cleaning around it, I noticed makeup placed on the counter products that I knew with certainty had only come out after 2015. We were in 2017, and he had told me his wife had died in 2009. If the vanity had really been left intact, it would have looked much more aged. If I wasn't already uncomfortable before this, now I was deeply so. Fortunately, for the rest of the time I spent upstairs, he didn't come back or speak to me. I dreaded having to go down to the ground floor, but I was halfway through and only had to go to the end. I had arrived at the kitchen and had started there. From the kitchen, you had a view of the living room, and again something was wrong. There were no photos hanging on the walls. I've cleaned hundreds of houses to date, and never have I seen an interior without a single image. Even people living alone have at least a few greeting cards magnetized on the fridge. I couldn't say why this troubled me so much, but it did. And just as I had resolved to finish quickly and give him a discount, he appeared in the doorway and asked if he could ask me for a small favor. I responded hesitantly, "Which one?" He then explained that he knew it was stipulated no basement, but he had completely forgotten he was having guests the following week. That's where the pool table and everything else was, and he simply wanted a quick vacuum. I told him I was very pressed that day, that I wasn't sure I could take care of it, but maybe another time. He then proposed that I skip the unused dining room and just take care of the basement floors. I replied that I could come back the next day to clean the whole basement, not just the floors, a way for me to buy time. But that's precisely when his attitude changed completely. He became strange, insistent. He kept repeating that he simply wanted the floors done, and that he didn't understand why I couldn't do it right then. He added that he and his wife really needed it done, his wife, the one who had been dead for years. That's when I understood with horror that this man was probably planning something terrible, even if I didn't know what. I told him, if I have time, I'll do it. He insisted, I can just show you what needs to be done down there. it'll only take a moment. Knowing he wouldn't let it go, I pretended to take a phone call and went to another room. There I actually called a friend to explain the situation. He was still watching me with persistence, so I spoke in Spanish, praying he didn't understand a word. My friend agreed to come to the address to make sure that when I left, he wouldn't try anything or follow me. I then hung up and told him there was a family emergency, and I would come back the next day to finish, which was of course a lie. He gave me an icy look and simply said, "Don't bother." Then he went upstairs while I gathered my things. I knew I wouldn't be paid, but at this point, I already felt lucky to be able to leave. My friend arrived while I was loading my trunk, and the man was staring at me from the window without looking away for a single second. I left. Once I got home, I called the police to report the facts, but there wasn't much to do. He hadn't done anything illegal, he had simply been disturbing. They told me what seemed obvious: never go back there, which of course I wasn't considering. Just a reminder for everyone. If you offer your services via sites like Craigslist, there's no foolproof way to know who you're dealing with. Always listen to your instinct and inform someone of the address where you're going as well as the time you're supposed to leave, just in case. I'll never know what this man was plotting or what he planned to do to me in that basement, and I hope no one ever has to find out. Although this happened quite some time ago, this experience continues to deeply trouble me. Around September of last year, I spent the night at my grandparents' house in rural Michigan. That evening, everything seemed to unfold in a rather ordinary way. We enjoyed my grandmother's delicious pot roast, watched television, then looked through some old photographs. When night fell, I went to the guest room that had once been mine when we lived with them around 2 a.m. I started some music on my laptop to help me fall asleep gently. Let me tell you that there had been some paranormal manifestations when we lived there, but I would never have qualified them as frightening or terrifying. For example, I've always been a light sleeper, and the slightest muffled footstep on the wooden floor was enough to wake me up. This had happened several times, discreet footsteps in the hallway adjoining my room, followed by my grandparents' assurances that neither of them had gotten up that night. Once I even went to check, but all the doors were closed and no one seemed awake. The layout of my room was actually a bit strange compared to the other rooms. A corner of the wall led to a small hallway ending at the front door, which meant you couldn't see the door from the bed, only the hallway leading to it. I must have fallen asleep quite quickly because I woke up with a start without even remembering the moment I had drifted off to sleep. It must have been around 4 a.m., and I felt extremely tired. This surprised me somewhat because ordinarily when I wake up in the middle of the night, I'm rather alert, which explains why I wake up so easily. But this time, an unusual heaviness was crushing me. I hadn't heard anything that could have woken me up, but this sudden torpor made me think I hadn't come out of sleep on my own. With half-closed eyelids, I directed my gaze toward the small hallway, seeing nothing in the darkness. I put my head back on the pillow and closed my eyes. I stayed like this for a few minutes on the edge of sleep before hearing the sinister sound of my bedroom door closing. My eyes immediately opened and I sat up, staring at the silent darkness of the hallway. I remained frozen in this position for what seemed like an eternity before getting up and going to the door. There was nothing, but I knew something was wrong. I always leave this door closed, so who had opened it? This thought chilled my blood. I immediately locked the door and rushed under the covers. I convinced myself it might have been one of my grandparents, although I found no plausible reason for this gesture. Trying to evacuate the incident from my mind, I closed my eyes, forcing myself to silence. That's when I heard heavy, hurried footsteps echoing in the hallway, heading straight for the door. They seemed naked, weighing, stopping abruptly right in front. I stayed there, petrified, my heart pounding, unable to move. A few agonizing seconds passed. Then I heard the door slam violently again. What terrified me was that I had seen it close barely a minute earlier without ever hearing it open. I was gripped by icy panic. I didn't dare go back to bed. I stayed sitting, eyes wide open, until dawn broke. I didn't tell my grandparents anything so as not to alarm them. I simply found a pretext to leave earlier and go home. A few months later, while sleeping at a friend's house in Minneapolis, lying on the floor trying to find sleep with my eyes closed, I heard it again, the sound of a door closing, this time very softly. I glanced at my friend, who was sleeping soundly and hadn't perceived anything, as he confirmed to me the next morning. Strangely, I never heard this sound again after that day, and never in my own house. I still don't understand what I experienced, but a persistent feeling gnaws at me, that of being watched by a supernatural entity. I don't grasp the meaning of this door that was already closed closing again. But if someone could give me an explanation or suggest a way to get rid of it, I would be infinitely grateful. Because even today, I lie down each evening with an anxious mind, dreading waking up to face horror. You made it to the end of the stories. That means it's the perfect time to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And if you haven't already, leave a like and drop a comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have a great time relaxing, and good night.